Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'm going to be talking about Occam's Razor. And Occam's Razor is interesting. I mean, I titled this video, "The Occam's Razor Cuts Both Ways," because the thing about Occam's Razor is it has basically no actual utility. And that's apart from it being a razor, which is a heuristic. That is something which is true in many circumstances, but all that means is you have to know the particular circumstances to know whether or not it applies. And if you know the particular circumstances, the general guideline, well, isn't going to be very useful because you actually have studied the particular circumstances. But the thing about Occam's Razor, which makes it sort of cut both ways, is that it's all about what you're applying it to. Now, there are various statements of Occam's Razor, such as do not multiply entities beyond necessity, or if they're competing explanations, the simpler one is usually the correct one. Or there are variants. The original, actually, from William of Occam, had to do with the problem of universals. That is to say, it's a philosophical problem that is entirely obscure in the contemporary times. Very, very, very loosely, you can describe it as, do two tables actually have something in common with each other, or do they merely remind us of each other? Do two dogs have something in common with each other, or do they merely remind us of each other? That's not actually the philosophical statement, but it kind of gets the idea across. To sort of translate the problem into a modern context, not exactly, it's more like an analogy in a modern context, although it kind of has a lot to do with the original, would be the question of, are there laws of physics, or does God just do everything? And Occam's Razor would state, well, no, there are no laws of physics. There's no reason to posit these laws of physics. God just does everything. And yeah, there are some things that happen that are similar to other things. They remind us of them. But, God just keeps doing things, and some of them are like each other. There's no reason to posit these laws of physics as existing and doing something when there's no reason to believe in them. There's just a commonality of God's action. Plus or minus, that's kind of vaguely analogous to what William of Occam was using his famous razor for. Which is kind of one of the things that makes it kind of amusing in the way it often gets used these days. But actually, speaking of amusing ways of using Occam's Razor, I'm going to mention an example of what is, to my mind, extremely funny, because it is both comes from atheists and is one of the greatest violation possible of Occam's Razor, and it's actually going to illustrate the central point of this video extremely well. That is the infinite multiverse. For those who don't know, it's roughly the idea that every time anything happens at the subatomic level, for which there isn't a deterministic outcome, that what happens is the universe splits off into multiple copies of itself, and as many as there are possible outcomes, and for each possible outcome, there's a universe in which it happened that way. And this is funny on so many levels. But the relevant point here is that it is, properly speaking, the maximal violation of Occam's Razor. It is multiplying entities wildly beyond necessity. We have no use for extra universes. There's no point in them. They don't explain anything whatsoever. There's zero evidence for any of these things. There cannot, in principle, be evidence for any of these things because they're, by definition, separate from each other and don't interact. This is the maximal way to multiply entities because you've got this infinite multiverse. All these universes you're positing exist without explaining anything or for no reason. But, and this is sort of the key to explaining what I'm getting at, the people who propose the infinite multiverse think that actually they're making things simpler because there's just one sort of principle rather than having reasons why things come out the way they come out. Now it's nice and simple. It's nice and easy. Everything just happens and all possibilities happen. So for any given question of why did this unlikely chain of events happen, it's it's because it's one possible chain of events and all possibilities happened. And so of course these, unlikely ones will happen. We just happen to be asking this question in the universe in which that one happened. Obviously, it sort of ties into the weak anthropic principle. And so they don't think that they are multiplying entities beyond necessity. They think they're keeping things simple. So, which is it? Well, in one sense, they're multiplying entities wildly beyond necessity. In one sense, they're not. Because they're looking at different things. On the one hand, I laugh at this because I'm looking at the number of actual things, like rocks and trees and stars and galaxies and so on. Whereas they're sort of looking at like number of, well, it gets a little bit complicated because, of course, the actual, when an electron might, show up in several different places, it's not creating spare copies of the sun and the earth and the moon and the stars and so on. Something else would be doing this, and so they're sort of, pulling this back. It's obviously not God, even though there's like a single principle that's like creating stuff, because it's, a stupid principle. I don't mean holding it as stupid, I mean it as a principle of something that is stupid. Unintelligent, irrational, whichever word you want to mean the same thing. But the idea is that principle has no idea what it's actually doing. It's just blindly following some process, and that process happens to produce the stuff that we see. I mean, stupid in that sense. And so, basically, they're thinking because there's only sort of like one principle, this becomes, very simple and straightforward. And so actually, this is simplifying the things that need to exist in what is generating the universe somehow. I mean, it doesn't actually, but that's a topic for another day. The relevant part is, as I sort of was getting at, depending on which thing you're looking at, you're either making it wildly more complex or you're simplifying it. Well, this is kind of the case for all applications of Occam's Razor. It's all going to be a matter of which thing are you simplifying, because most of the time, simplifying in one place complexifies in another. In general, in life, these things tend to be balancing acts, where, like, in order for one thing to be simple, something else has to be complex. So, like, people will be very impressed by that you can, generate complex patterns on a, computer screen using a very, very simple rule of just how you go from one line of pixels to the next based on what was previous. And so you can get these complex, intricate patterns of triangles like the Sierpinski triangle based upon this simple rule. So see, just that, the simple thing can generate this complex thing. Well, yeah, if you're not counting the complexity of the computer. Because the whole reason that you can actually do this is because you've got this computer using billions of transistors to implement logic and memory and digital to analog converters and so on. The only reason you get this complexity out of that simple rule is because you're ignoring all of the complexity in the computer. So, like, yeah, if you sweep the complexity in the computer under the carpet, you've got this simple rule that generates this complex thing. But that's not overall simple. You're sweeping the computer under the rug. And so this is what happens in pretty much all applications of Occam's Razor. Whenever someone's applying Occam's Razor, pretty much invariably what they're doing is sweeping some complexity somewhere under the rug. That's not always true. I mean, there are cases where people are, simply wrong in particular ways, and you point it out, but usually in those cases, Occam's Razor isn't very helpful. I'd have to go into major tangents to get into specific examples of that, so I'm going to leave it at that generality that I'm not backing up, but that's been my experience, and if you look into it, you'll have the same experience. But this is pretty much the reason why I said Occam's Razor cuts both ways. Because if you sweep some complexity under the rug to simplify one thing, you can always say this is a violation of Occam's Razor, or you can say that you can go the other way and say that, not sweep it under the rug and say that the other thing is a violation of Occam's Razor. And so by deciding what you're going to simplify, because nobody anywhere has a grand unified theory of literally everything that has ever happened, such that one can analyze whether this grand unified theory of anything that ever has happened is simpler than any other grand unified theory of everything that has ever happened. Because, I mean that in specific, as in to take every single thing that has ever happened, every breeze, every leaf that falls, every volcano that erupts, etc., and explain literally all of these things. No one's got one of those. So we can't look at these theories that explain absolutely everything and compare these various theories that explain absolutely everything and pick the simpler ones of those. No one's got one of those. They're always picking what thing they want to actually explain, and so you'll always be in the circumstance where you can say that, aha, your explanation is too complex because, of this thing that I'm considering, and therefore my explanation, which simplifies this thing, is better when I'm ignoring this other stuff over here. And then someone will always be able to say, aha, you're not looking at this stuff over here while you consider this part. And until such time as somebody is actually creating a grand unified theory of everything that has ever happened in detail, you'll always be able to do this intrinsically. You will always be only considering some part, and therefore there will always be some other complexity that your simplified look at is not going to explain. And that's kind of basically the actual problem with Occam's Razor. As a general principle, it's useless, because you're only ever looking at parts, and so it's all a question of what are you trying to simplify and what complexity are you ignoring, because you, being finite, are going to be ignoring a heck of a lot of complexity. So, yeah, it's kind of nifty. Its primary use, as far as I can see, is laughing at the sort of people who will both tell you about Occam's Razor and propose the infinite multiverse, because that's good for a good laugh in my experience. I still, when I think about it, chuckle. It's just so ironic. It's just so much fun. Other than that sort of, real life joke, it doesn't really do you much good. You can't use that in place of lots and lots of learning. And once you've done the lots and lots of learning, you'll know too much for this to be of any real use. You'll have to make, more particular judgments anyway. So, yeah, Occam's Razor. No substitute for the hard work of actually learning things. And not much use other than to laugh at the sort of people who like to use it if they're also into the infinite multiverse. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.